The patrons have magically spoon-fed us our next pick, Kadabra. Ever since Generation 1, it's had an imposing presence. Despite not being fully evolved, it packs excellent power for such a Pokemon, making it tough to take on in-game and even tougher to take on in your mind after you were terrified by Sabrina's Kadabra when Ash foolishly attempted to take her on in the Indigo League. Of course, Alakazam is one of the best competitive Pokemon of all time, but there are far worse things than being a lesser Alakazam, and Kadabra is quite strong and fast in its own right, with better special attack and speed stats than many fully evolved Pokemon. And so, we ask, how good was Kadabra actually? But before we start, once again, this video is sponsored by Surfshark VPN. Surfshark is an app and browser extension that allows you to place your computer or phone virtually in any country as if you're actually there. Surfshark has thousands of servers in over 100 plus countries. And by using Surfshark, you can connect to servers in other countries and you can get access to content that is normally region locked. For example, if you want to watch Naruto Shippuden on American Netflix, well, you can't. I mean, they have the movies, but they don't have the main series for some reason. But all you have to do is change your IP to Canada, and now you have access to 10 seasons of Naruto Shippuden on Canadian Netflix. This is just one example of being able to find more content by using a different country's IP. There's so much content you could be missing out on because you're region locked. And of course, being a VPN, Surfshark encrypts your data so that no one can access it while you're online, and your privacy is secured. Well, Black Friday is coming up this month, and the homies at Surfshark are feeling generous with their exclusive Black Friday deal. Get an exclusive Surfshark Black Friday deal when you enter the promo code FALLSWIPE to get up to 6 additional months for free when you sign up. And Surfshark is completely safe to sign up for thanks to their 30-day money-back guarantee. And in this video, we'll be going over these competitive formats. You know how the Psychic type famously dominated the first generation? Well, that didn't just apply to Ubers and OU. It was very much part of UU as well. Kadabra was basically UU's version of Alakazam. Not just in the way it played, which was identical, but also in the way it was one of the very best Pokemon in the tier. It was considered on par with the similarly elite Dugtrio, leaving them tied in their consideration as approximately the 3rd best in the tier, only behind another Psychic type, Hypno, and the king of the tier, Tentacruel. Was Kadabra not outclassed by Hypno? Well, first of all, not really, in the sense that you would love to run both on your team just as you might run Zapdos and Raikou together in Gen 2 OU. The more Psychics, the merrier in Gen 1. And second of all, not really in the sense that while Kadabra was incredibly physically frail in comparison, it had several significant advantages. It was stronger by 5 base specials, sure, so not by a mile or anything, but its Psychics did hit harder. In fact, Kadabra had the 2nd highest special stat around, only 5 base special behind Articuno, and Articuno didn't have Kadabra's nasty crit rate. Indeed, that crit rate meant that in practice, the difference in power behind Kadabra and Hypno was especially felt because Kadabra, by virtue of its far better speed stat, had a much nastier critical hit rate as per Gen 1 mechanics. That speed stat was also particularly valuable in vaulting Kadabra above the aforementioned tier king Tentacruel, something Hypno could only dream of. In fact, Kadabra was one of the fastest Pokemon in the tier as a whole. It was only outsped by Dugtrio, Persian, and the rare Aerodactyl. This made it one of the scariest Pokemon to face. The best stab in the game off huge special and a nasty crit rate? Terrifying, especially if your own Psychics had been worn down previously. Late game Kadabra was just lights out, especially since it stung so many popular Psychic weak Pokemon like Tentacruel, Haunter, Venusaur super effectively. And it blasted through the low special stats of the physical attackers Kangaskhan and Dodrio before they could hurt it. Kadabra wasn't just regulated to the late game either. It also loved making things happen mid-game, opening the game up for its teammates by ripping holes in the opposing team's defenses thanks to not just its crit rate, but also Psychic's 1/3 special drop rate, making it even stronger, which tended to force more switches. Oh, and to make matters worse, nothing was going to block Kadabra's Thunder Wave, since switching a ground type in meant risking it getting blasted by Psychic, and when you have to deal with potential full paralysis on top of the assault that Kadabra already is, it gets nightmarish fast. Many times the best way to take on Kadabra was with, you guessed it, your own Kadabra, getting in unpleasant one-on-one situations, replete with full paralysis and special drops. Suffice to say, Kadabra was a dominant force in Generation 1 UU, one of the most incredible Pokemon around, forcibly shaping the metagame around it to adapt or be crushed, and sometimes even preparing for it wouldn't be enough. Such was the power of the fast Gen 1 Psychic type, which Kadabra exemplified perfectly. As GSC UU developed, players looked at Kadabra more and more. On the one hand, it was incredibly frail and couldn't switch into much since it was terrified of status. Furthermore, the prominence of Rest Talk hurt its ability to break through opposing teams. On the other hand, it was tied with Magneton for the highest special attack in the tier, and Psychic was still a ferocious stab, especially with all the high tier poison types running around, such as Quillfish, Haunter, and of course, the tier queen, Nidoqueen. Of course, Kadabra also packed an amazing speed stat which tied with Scyther and Electabuzz, two of the best Pokemon around, and the options for actually outspeeding them were few. So often Kadabra would be at least tied for the fastest Pokemon in any given battle. As such, Kadabra began seeing usage and exploration alongside another emerging Psychic type, Mr. Mime. Of course, the tier was populated by Rest Talk, Hypno, and the Slow Twins, so it's not like their Psychics were automatically dropping everything in sight, but nor were they hapless against them. Kadabra delighted in using Thief to steal their leftovers, forcing them to heal off chip damage actively with Rest and making them much more exploitable in the process, especially when it came to trying to break through Slowking with Thunder Punch later on. Encore was another particularly nasty move in its toolkit that could really throw a wrench in an opponent's game plan, suddenly nullifying a check as a viable answer to Kadabra and forcing something else to switch in and getting blasted. For a time, Kadabra was quite a good Pokemon in GSC UU. Sadly, this didn't last as several major metagame developments were quite unkind to it. Slowly but surely, Nidoqueen was no longer the best Pokemon in the tier. This in and of itself wasn't bad, but it started facing serious competition with a ground type not threatened by Kadabra's Psychic, Piloswine. The new ruler of the tier, Granbull, didn't especially like taking Psychic, but it took it a lot better and threatened Kadabra a lot harder in return. Furthermore, Kadabra's complete inability to switch into anything made more and more players wary of using it, and this went hand in hand with its ultimate death nail, the fact that it didn't have competition with Mr. Mime. It was completely outclassed by Mr. Mime. Mr. Mime was able to directly threaten the Psychic type walls with Nightmare and Encore far better thanks to its superior bulk, letting it hit the field and stay on it, whereas Kadabra's immense frailty made getting onto the field enough to be able to pull this off over a prolonged period more challenging. Mr. Mime's far better bulk gave it more opportunities in general, so the fact that its Psychic didn't hit quite as hard didn't really matter, plus the fact that it had Thunder as opposed to Kadabra's Thunder Punch meant it was actually immediately threatening the daylights out of the Slow Twins and Blastoise. Kadabra didn't become outright unviable or anything, but its viability in the tier took a serious blow, becoming more specific, more niche in its usage. The trainer had to really get the most out of its amazing speed stat, because otherwise Mr. Mime was going to give you more bang for your buck. Still, all things considered, this was far from an unsuccessful generation for Kadabra. Historically, not fully evolved Pokemon were banned from Gen 3 UU. The most notable example of such an omission would be Haunter. The exception was Scyther, but that's because it wasn't an exact copy of its evolution Scizor, which relates to why the rule existed in the first place. Players came to UU to get away from OU, and thus didn't want to simply face not fully evolved UU versions of OU Pokemon. This rule was more idealistic than it was practical, but Advanced UU was such a beloved metagame that nobody really minded it. Until recently. Previously, Kadabra had not seen any use in UU for this reason. However, when the subject came up, the player base agreed that this was a Pokemon that they wouldn't want in the tier on the basis of its brokenness. With the new lack of maxed out EVs, Kadabra's Psychic hit harder than ever and would likely rip through the tier, especially since it now had a boosting option in Calm Mind that would make it one of the fiercest late game Pokemon. And if you tried to stay in to prevent it from boosting, it could obliterate your Vileplume or Hitmonlee or what have you with Psychic on the spot. This was pretty much what came to pass when not fully evolved Pokemon were finally tested in UU. The player base wound up banning Kadabra because yeah, it sliced through everything with its Scyther equivalent speed and a stab move which made Scyther green with envy. Greener than usual anyway. As a result, Kadabra thoroughly earned its BL classification in Gen 3. And fun fact, since Alakazam wasn't quite good enough for OU, yet hilariously overpowered by UU standards, this means that in Gen 3, Alakazam and Kadabra are in the same tier. And with all this in mind, Gen 3 was another successful one for Kadabra. Generation 4's power creep finally knocked Alakazam into UU, so Kadabra definitely wasn't going to keep up this time around. Sadly, it wasn't able to keep up in NU either. It wasn't a bad Pokemon at all. In fact, in and of itself, it was quite decent, hitting incredibly hard with the newly added Life Orb. However, it was entirely outclassed by Gardevoir, who is stronger and far bulkier, the latter of which let it use two excellent abilities efficiently, whereas Kadabra was knocked over by a light breeze, and it had a much better move pool to boot. If you wanted a speedier psychic type, Jinx was also one of the very best Pokemon in the tier, and it made up for its slightly lower special attack, really just barely, with Stab, Ice Beam, and an amazing move pool including Lovely Kiss. Kadabra's speed was immense, true, and getting the jump on Charizard was excellent, but it wasn't nearly enough to justify its use over two superior fast offensive psychics. However, since Kadabra wasn't a fully evolved Pokemon, not being good enough for NU was not a source of shame for it. It's a bonus if such Pokemon are viable, but they're not expected to. They're not fully formed after all. Plus, if you really wanted to use Kadabra in NU, it'd actually do pretty well, so long as you supported its frailty to copious U-turning teammates. It'd be outclassed, but you could do much worse, and thus we see nothing wrong in proclaiming this generation another successful one for Kadabra. Kadabra received the incredible Magic Guard in Generation 5, which vaulted it to viability in this new iteration of NU, no longer outclassed by Gardevoir. With Spike support, it could brandish its amazing Charizard beating speed in conjunction with its place as one of the tier's strongest special attackers to wield two fiercely effective late-game cleaning sets. It usually preferred the security of its unbreakable via passive damage Focus Sash, which let it go toe-to-toe with most offensive Pokemon one-on-one and gave it a great deal of flexibility in game, but it could also slap on a recoil-free Life Orb to unleash terrifyingly strong attacks that mold through common bulky Pokemon like Alomomola and Golurk, to say nothing of the tier's many psychic weak staples like Garbodor and Girder. Of course, Kadabra's specific playstyle meant it wasn't going to be slapped on every type of team. It was strictly a very fast-paced offense type of Pokemon, as if you wanted a Magic Guard Psychic with any sort of longevity, Duocean was going to be your choice every single time. Even on those fast offense teams, Kadabra was far from an automatic choice. Late game cleaning could also be done by Scarf Gardevoir or the slow turn fast style of offensive Trick Room Duocean. However, Kadabra's unique blend of naturally high speed, not needing to devote its item to Scarf, or a move slot and a turn to Trick Room, ensured it was far from outclassed. Indeed, it was one of the scarier Pokemon to face in an endgame scenario, because you often had to hit it twice thanks to Sash, and that was often too much to handle when the chips were down and the teams were weakened. Kadabra was a superb cleanup artist and excelled in its small, specific, yet lethal niche in Gen 5 NU. And believe it or not, Kadabra was used in OU on a few occasions, never in anything too serious mind you, but as players explored the brokenness of Sand Magic Guard Spikes teams to their fullest extent, anchored by the incredibly busted Alakazam, some players concluded that Zam was so good, they would very much like to run a second Zam. No, not Reuniclus. Well, also Reuniclus perhaps, but still they needed more. They needed a Zam-like blend of speed and power, and yes, that meant Alakazam Kadabra teams did actually get tested. They were genuinely quite decent. Okay, Kadabra wasn't winning any awards for OU's finest wall breaker or anything like that, and it notably lacked Focus Blast in its move pool, but it still hit quite hard thanks to its good special attack and super effective coverage, especially when supported by permanent sand and multiple layers of spikes. Its job was simply to weaken the Zam counters for Zam to clean up later. After all, what better to lure in your counters than another version of you? Additionally, one could use the less useful Kadabra Sash defensively to check a big threat, while still maintaining a fully operational Alakazam for later in the game, where it was at its most threatening. All in all, between its place in NU and its honest to goodness appearance in OU, Generation 5 was another successful one for Kadabra. There was a new lowest tier in town come Generation 6, below NU. There was now PU, and there Kadabra and its Focus Sash set were a significant part of the tier. Kadabra was excellent because of the security it brought its team against the tier's high-powered offensive threats like Stoutland, Rotom Frost, and Combuskin, whose presence often made for tumultuous endgames, wherein withstanding their hits was no longer an option, except with Kadabra, who could always stomach one, which was a huge advantage to have. Additionally, its speed meant it blitzed past most of the tier, making it even more threatening. It was the single best revenge killer in the tier. Even the otherwise elite Scarf Rotom Frost had to contend with Stealth Rock, whereas Kadabra darted in and out of battle, almost always with a preserved Sash in tow against most of its revenge killing targets, even more so if utilized well on double switches or paired with switch move using teammates like Rotom Frost itself. Plus, it didn't even need to necessarily KO something in order to neutralize its threat. Thunder Wave would do the job there, as would the occasional Encore. Funnily enough, it was other not fully evolved Pokemon that tended to give it issues, as the Eviolite laden PU metagame meant there was a level of bulk that even the generally powerful Kadabra wasn't immediately going to break through. Furthermore, Kadabra couldn't utilize Spikes as it normally would to push this extra damage on these targets, because Spikes were a rarity in PU, without any good reliable users. Thus, its use was limited, and not as easy to slap on a team as Behem and its old nemesis Mr. Mime, the tier's best psychic types. Regardless, Kadabra was a legitimate, useful part of of Gen 6 PU that provided speed, strength, and stability in turbulent endgame scenarios against threats potentially spiraling out of control. Kadabra returned to PU in Generation 7 and was a solid choice once again. It particularly loved that spikes were an effective strategy again, as they fully enabled its threat potential. Its stab psychic threatened the daylights out of many metagame staples like Quillfish, Girder, and arguably the most obnoxious Pokemon in the tier, Victory Bell. Of course, there were other speedy psychics in the tier, and the likes of Jinx and Alolan Raichu, for example, were generally far easier to slap on a team than Kadabra, but Magic Guard Sash ensured Kadabra always had a niche to once again provide stability against high-octane offensive teams and the many threats that came packing. What was particularly nice about Kadabra in Gen 7 was that thanks to a newfound moveset and ability compatibility, it would now use Counter alongside Magic Guard. This most notably meant any attempts to Pursuit Trap it with Skuntank would get rocketed right back at the user, while also ensuring Kadabra could take out any physical attacker it had to go one-on-one with without needing to pack the power to KO it. Kadabra's spikes and hyper-offensive reliant playstyle meant it was specific once again, but it allowed these generally fast-paced, somewhat risky teams to function consistently thanks to its reliability in taking on a slew of major threats, as well as posing the threat itself with its great speed, solid power, and valuable coverage with Psychic. It wasn't a true PU Pokemon by usage this time around, but it was certainly a legitimate part of the tier for its superb revenge killing capabilities, and so Fantastic Mr. Fox had another successful generation under its belt. Kadabra arrived in Generation 8 alongside the Isle of Armor DLC and immediately appeared in PU, where with the newly limited Pokedex, its power stood out more than before. Sash sets were already hard-hitting and were tougher to deal with because they helped Kadabra work around its frailty, but Life Orb sets obliterated just about everything with their vicious power. There was pretty much nothing Kadabra couldn't smash through, Psychic Resist very much included. Krokorok got ripped apart by Dazzling Gleam, while Musharna and Mr. Rime got blasted by Shadow Ball, and if these pokes couldn't take it on, nearly nothing could, since the rest of the tier got crushed by Psychic. As usual, Kadabra was also one of the fastest Pokemon around, and with the only non-Scarfers to outrun it being Boltund and Raichu, while it tied in speed with tier staples Galarian, Rapidash, and Manectric. This allowed it to bombard the opponent with its hard-hitting attacks consistently, especially with switch move support from teammates helping it hit the field without taking damage. Sadly, this did not last, as the Crown Tundra DLC's enormous power creep knocked Kadabra out of the tier entirely. The tier was faster, stronger, bulkier, and now centered around Pokemon that naturally matched up incredibly well against Kadabra, such as Gigalith, Aggron, Ferrocy, Audino, Togedemaru, and Eldegoss. Gen 8 removing hidden power really hurt Kadabra here, as it meant it was hapless against staples like Aggron it would have effortlessly deleted in previous generations. It probably wouldn't have been that much better anyway. Regardless, Kadabra didn't fall to untiered because it was a not fully evolved Pokemon, and it had its success already. Was that an 8th consecutive successful generation for a not fully evolved Pokemon? Why, yes, it was. And that's it. So how good was Kadabra actually? Well, it has been one of the most commonly used non-fully evolved Pokemon in the competitive scene since its inception. It's a stage 2 Pokemon too, so we're not talking Little Cup here. No, just a good old level 100 singles. Kadabra has appeared in one form or another in a lower tier in each of the 8 generations it's been in, and it has found some form of success every time. Even in Gen 4 NU, when it really shouldn't have been used since it was so outclassed, but trainers liked it so much that they used it and found success with it anyway. Of course, it's also had high points like its dominance over Gen 1 UU, its brief tenure as a major threat in Gen 2 UU, and its ban from Gen 3 UU, the one it earned. All in all, Kadabra has brought more great competitive success to the Alakazam line. Now all that's left is to examine the destroyer of Little Cup, Abra. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thank you so much to the patrons for continued support of our videos and for voting for this Pokemon for this month's patron pick. And if you liked the video and you want to see more, be sure to subscribe to False Swipe Gaming for more weekly Pokemon content. And in the comments, I want to know, what do you think about competitive Kadabra? Whatever it is, let me know in the comments. And follow my crew on these social media platforms. And that's all I got. See you next time, everyone.